What you need to do is a risk assessment, and that's what government should be doing. They shouldn't be having these emotional arguments about what the public feel. The public can be swayed very easily with emotional arguments. You need to do the risk assessment. It's as simple as that.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 157 for the 18th of May 2023.
William, how long were you going on for?
We went on for a long time. I was talking to Freda Wallace, I think for nearly 2 hours. That's just much too long to put into one podcast. So I think what we're going to do is to put half of the interview, the first half of the interview, in the podcast today as normal, and then just tomorrow release a second podcast. They're both working out as pretty much full-length podcasts, and we put the second one up, which is the second half of the interview with Freda Wallace, tomorrow. So I think, Kevin, you get to do the rant today, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, William. Gotta get into my best ranting voice.
Okay, let's hear it.
I want to comment on a rant that was previously posted on this podcast. The rant in question was posted with episode 120, Levelling the Field, and the topic was minimum unit alcohol pricing, or MUP. MUP, long-term listeners may recall, prohibits the selling of an alcoholic beverage below a price determined by the alcohol content of the beverage. To recap, by my reading, William made three arguments. First, that the MUP policy is motivated by a desire to advantage pubs over off-licence competitors. Second, that demand for alcohol is inelastic and therefore this measure is unlikely to be an effective measure for reducing alcohol consumption. Third, and relatedly, that higher prices may paradoxically lead to increased consumption. Therefore, it was concluded that MUP should not be perceived as a public health measure. Supporting evidence is presented by pointing out that page 26 of the 2011 Fine Gael General Election Manifesto says that below-cost alcohol sales will be banned to support the viability of pubs. Further, it was noted that Ireland has both high alcohol consumption and high alcohol prices, so the correlation is not there to support price increases as a preventative measure. Finally, marketing strategies from other industries, like the diamond trade, were identified as positive examples of an industry conspiring to increase the price of a product to increase its perceived importance. First, I think we shouldn't dismiss MUP as a public health measure without presenting what public health professionals think of it. There is peer-reviewed academic literature which describes how an advocacy coalition called Alcohol Health Alliance Ireland was formed by the public health community specifically to secure the enactment of the 2015 Public Health Alcohol Bill, which contains MUP alongside other provisions. The bill was informed by an alcohol steering group, co-chaired by Tony Houlihan, that recommended restrictions on price and other measures based on the international best practice evidence. By the way, the coalition was imposed by an industry group, and Diageo are alleged to have threatened to reduce operations in Ireland over the policy. This is one reason why I'm not worried that this measure serves the interests of the pub lobby or is part of a scheme to increase the sales of alcohol. It also needs to be said that a ban on below-cost sales would mean that retailers are not allowed to sell an alcohol product at a price that is less than the cost of its manufacture. Retailers sometimes do this for strategic reasons to undercut and drive out competitors. The policy that was proposed in the 2011 Fine Gael manifesto is different to the MUP measure that was introduced in the bill that became the 2018 Public Health Alcohol Act. Another reason that I'm not concerned is that all available evidence suggests that the policy will be effective. The World Health Organization's draft Global Alcohol Action Plan endorses pricing policies to control consumption, and a brand new study in The Lancet has found that Scotland's MUP policies are associated with reductions in deaths and hospitalisation. Scotland's lessons, by the way, are the most relevant for what is possible changing Ireland's drinking culture. As Professor Frank Murray of the RCPI has pointed out, we can't easily compare ourselves to the sunny beaches of the Mediterranean, as was suggested in episode 120, because the context is just too different. Finally, I'm not unduly concerned by the fact that the instrument used to increase alcohol prices was regulation rather than taxation. We already have taxes on alcohol products. A problem with increasing taxes on alcohol products as a standalone measure is that the measure may be undermined if retailers respond with a tactic called undershifting. This means that for cheap alcoholic beverages, the retailer does not pass on the full cost of a tax increase to consumers. Instead, they offset their losses by increasing the cost of more expensive alcohol products. This is a ploy to keep the cheap alcohol cheap. This highlights why MUP works. The most problematic drinkers are interested in the greatest volume of alcohol for the lowest price. This includes young people who are among the groups most impacted by MUP. From a life course perspective, this measure is well suited to the mission of ensuring that young people are less likely to form a relationship with alcohol that will affect the rest of their lives. Consider also that it's not just the total volume of alcohol consumed that determines harm, but patterns of drinking. This makes hospitalizations, the outcome used in the Lancet study, a good outcome measure for studies of MUP. How many trips to the hospital may be averted by the fact that a student was just a little bit less drunk than they might have been had their pre-drinks budget bought a bit more alcohol? It's possible that there is a convoluted attempt to use MUP to increase alcohol sales for pubs, but applying Occam's razor to the facts leads me to the conclusion that the Public Health Alcohol Act of 2018 is exactly what it says on the label. In a moment, we'll have that interview with Freda Wallace, but first of all, I'd like to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. We really appreciate everyone who donates. We don't get any huge money out of it, not nearly in the same league as some other Irish podcasters that we could mention. It pays for things like web hosting, and William and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster when we get a new patron on Patreon. It lets us know that there are people out there who listen and appreciate the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You are more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think you can do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of a pint once or twice a month, there's details of how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
On the last podcast, I was talking to Graham Linehan, the creator of Father Ted and other TV shows, who has taken a strident interest in women's rights and how he sees them as under threat from the trans rights movement. That led to a huge reaction on Twitter, including comments to the effect that I wasn't willing to put any trans people on the podcast, which wasn't true, but I mentioned that I had made many attempts to get various prominent trans people and speakers from trans organisations onto the podcast to no avail, and very bravely there stepped forward Freda Wallace, who said she'd be happy to come on the podcast. So I'm delighted to have her on the podcast now. She is the co-host of the Gender Nebulous podcast. She's a media facilitator and a trans rights advocate and a volunteer with the LGBT Foundation in Manchester. Freda, a huge focus has developed on the trans issue in the past few years. How do trans people feel about this whole hullabaloo?
Well, hello, William. It seems to have escalated. Like, the media interest in us used to be kind of peripheral, and it was more of a fascination, really. Yeah, sometimes you'd see a program about trans people on Channel 4, or it'd be more of a sort of curiosity, kind of look into their lives, and it was never in a bad faith. It was always just celebratory. It seemed like they wanted to include us genuinely in the conversation about LGBTQ rights, because we are part of that community. Trans people tend to grow up in those communities, so we understand what it's like to be marginalised. So we tend to stick together. But in the media in recent years, there's always been people that don't like us. Let's not mess about. We always know that, there's always going to be people, for whatever reason, don't like trans, don't like gay people, don't like whatever it is. But it seems to have been ramped up really, really unnecessarily and brutally in the last, say, 6 years. I can chart it from there. But I only got interested in this recently because I came out about 3 years ago, and I'd been active on the gay scene. I'd been a bit of a drag queen for a bit, but I didn't see the vitriol and the kind of people that really didn't, they use social media like a weapon, basically, to attack trans people. Now, there's that side of it, because you're, like I said, on social media, on Twitter, you're always going to get extreme points of view, because people, when they're masked, when they're behind a keyboard, they tend to say things that they wouldn't normally say in real life.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the politicization of us that's changed. Now, in recent years, you've had the gender recognition reform in Scotland, and you've had a push for more trans inclusivity in events and on TV. And coupled with that, I think it goes back to the kind of, because we've got a very ultra conservative government at the moment that seem to be led by lobby groups.
Mm-hmm. You mean in the UK?
I'll get into that later, but that's the kind of top and bottom of it, as far as I'm concerned at the moment.
Okay. I want to say, just in this, I'm at a bit of a loss for the vocabulary. I know that a lot of people use the terms like pro and anti-trans, and I know you describe yourself as a trans rights advocate, and I would, see myself in that camp, being pro-trans. I don't think, I think the phrase trans rights are human rights, that's what I would identify with. I don't think anybody should have any more or less rights because they are or are not trans. And despite that, I got labelled as a bigot and a Nazi and a whole load of other things for just speaking to someone who might have a different point of view. And I don't really accept that pro and anti vocabulary, but I think in this podcast we'll just have to use it just for brevity. So I just want to kind of put an asterisk beside it to say that I'm not exactly endorsing that. And I know that trans people are not a monolith. There are, not all trans people agree with what you might call the orthodox precepts of the trans rights movement, and all people taking part in, what I might say are the more problematic aspects of the trans rights movement are not trans. I'd actually guess that a large majority of them are not trans. But notwithstanding all of that, and there are, of course, as you mentioned, evil and bigoted people out there. But would you agree that there are also people who are anti-trans in that way that I describe it? And even if you disagree with them, would you agree that there are people there who believe that, who disagree with you, but are also entirely honourable and are motivated only by a concern for their fellow human beings?
Yeah, I think you're right. There are people that are like, I meet people all the time that can ask me about my identity, because when you're trans, it's a bit different than being gay or a lesbian. I mean, for a start, you become like a visual protest, even if you don't want to be. There's something physically different and visibly, you're visible as the thing you are. So it's a bit like, when people talk about hate crimes, people get attacked because they look different, and it's not necessarily because their sexuality. It's just usually, when people are attacked, it's because somebody's found something they think is a weakness.
I understand that, and we'll come to that, but I just focus for a moment on the point that, and I think you said you do agree that there are people on the other side to you who are operating entirely in good faith.
Mm-hmm.
You would agree with that? Oh, okay, that's fair enough. And to be fair, in that whole hullabaloo on Twitter, you were certainly on the far more sane and moderate and considered voices in that. And I would say thank you for that.
I would just add to that, there's not sides to this. There's not like a trans side and an anti-trans side. There are just trans people. And sometimes you might notice in the media, somebody put something forward, said, I don't think trans women should be in women's prisons. No, that's a valid concern. That's a real, but it's not a problem for most. That's a problem for the prison service. And the way trans people see that is obviously that you've never talked about trans people before. You never mentioned us. So why are you mentioning us now?
Okay, I'll get to those topics, and we have an open-ended thing. I won't put a guillotine on this, so I will get to that. But one thing, just trying to keep this kind of thematically a little bit organised, that was very, very striking from the reaction to that podcast, and not just then, anywhere this discussion crops up, is that people from what I might call, and the phrase is not all that helpful, but we know what we mean, the pro-trans side, can be very, very notable in their hostility and their aggression in their language. And, people, as you say, once they're hiding behind a keyboard, can say things they wouldn't normally say. But very frequently what I see is that the meaning, however harsh or not the words are, the meaning of the words are not, I disagree with you, therefore you're wrong. They're saying you're wrong and therefore you're an inherently bad person. So there isn't so much an attack on the idea as on the person. They're playing the man and not the ball, as they might say in GAA circles here. And that disagreeing with them doesn't make you incorrect so much as it makes you evil. That doesn't promote understanding, really, does it?
I think when it comes to, I think we're talking about online things,
sure.
Here?
I mean, it goes into traditional media as well when you get this discussion, but it's largely online. But sure, isn't everybody?
So you've got a section of society that feel traumatized. You've got young trans people that can't get the healthcare they want. They don't know. They might be in a family where their mum and dad don't understand them. They need to run away from that family, and young people congregate on social media to connect because they feel lonely. Now, if you're in one of those, you've had that in your real life. Your brothers and sisters might disown you. Your actual family might hate you. And when you go into an online space and find out very powerful people with lots of money are also saying the same thing as your family, then you're going to be angry. You're not going to see them as a three-dimensional being that might have genuine concerns. You just hate that person.
But pause on that. In my observation, I know you're explaining it rather than endorsing it. But in fact, in my observation, actually only a minority of people doing that, and possibly quite a small minority of people doing that, are actually trans. It seems to be more people, who are setting themselves up. And I will divert slightly into my theory of Twitter. As far as I'm concerned, Twitter is a competition to be goodest. And, if you're in a Twitter thread where the generalized agreement is that X is true, then somebody will want to come along and say, yes, but XX is even truer. And there is a competition to say that in even stronger terms to gain likes and to gain that approval from strangers, which I think is perhaps quite strange. But I think that's what is happening there. And that is one of the things that is making this even more toxic. But and I don't want to spend the whole discussion on this, but I do think the way that it's discussed is important. And I mentioned this kind of people, from people who clearly never heard the podcast, saying, oh, but you would never put on a trans person. And I then said, well, actually, I've sent dozens of requests to various prominent trans people and to trans organizations, and typically they don't respond, and it's very difficult to get them on. And you get somebody coming back and say, yes, but that just proves how evil you are, and they're right not to come on. And you get this essentially unfalsifiable circular argument. And the quality of the argument there, you would have to agree, is very low.
Oh, it's terrible. And you see, this is one of the things that people that hate us use against us, because there are angry people out there who've got, they present themselves as trans. You don't know them. A lot of them are anonymous on Twitter, but we don't know. But they'll use that aggression. At protests, trans rights protests, if one trans person gets angry and shouts, that's the thing they promote. They don't look at the whole picture. So you are right. People are polarized, but what I would say is that the reason I did the podcast is because we need positive voices.
This is your own podcast, and let's plug it again. Gender Nebulous podcast. I'm sure you can get it by searching in whatever podcast app somebody uses.
Now, one of the reasons trans people might not come forward and speak to you is because when we do, and I've been on Talk TV, and I've been on GB News, and I've been on LBC, and I've been on some BBC programs, when that's put on social media, the comments are horrific. If you want to do an experiment now, go and find one of my videos where I'm on Talk TV, on the Talk TV Twitter, and look at none of those are from trans people. There are reams and reams, hundreds even, of people saying you're a man, why are you on the telly, oh God, you're ugly. They look at your appearance, they deconstruct you, they try and find other information on you. That's how they find out where you work. The next thing, you have to defend that at your workplace. And then if you've done anything else that's less than perfect, they'll find it.
Oh, okay. And I don't want to spend, I think we get very self-referential if we spend the whole discussion talking about Twitter, but I just want to give one example of that. I'm going to give one example of that. I'm going to give one example of that and move on. And this, I'll give it verbatim. So it's under my post about the podcast. Person writes, referring to Graham Lennon, he's disgusting. So not going for the argument, going for the person. He's disgusting. The language then says the language he uses is grotesque. The way he demands his voice should be heard over all women. It's hard to think of any other cultural figure from my youth that I've lost all respect for and compassion for. And then goes on to say, just to be clear, I will not be listening to the podcast. And I replied to this person that they might actually be better off to hold their fire until they had listened to the podcast and bow out of the conversation if they didn't want to listen to the podcast, which they're free not to do. And then this person did the thing, where you take a screenshot of a tweet instead of actually quoting it. I think that's supposed to show disapproval. It's like the Twitter equivalent of wearing rubber gloves to touch something. And she crops out the bit where she said how disgusted she was at something she hadn't listened to, and just dropped in my comment, and then commented, so here's how podcasts with their male host is to tell me, a female historian who has written about both the history of women's rights and the history of trans lives across the centuries, to stick to the core subject or bow out. There's a lot of people there who are really trying hard to manufacture some outrage, aren't there?
Well, there's a lot of point scoring going on, because it is like there's a sort of get them culture, like if you're right, it's like you've got your battalion of attack dogs and they've got theirs, and they'll tear each other apart in the comments section. And at the end of the day, everybody goes home tired and nobody's won anything.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. So let's park that and not talk about Twitter anymore.
Okay, if I can just say,
please do. Yeah, go ahead.
I have tried to speak to producers of TV shows and said, this person you've had on, I won't mention any names, there's quite a few prominent, I wouldn't call them anti-trans. I don't like to say anti-trans. I like to say trans skeptic.
That's fair enough.
Because that's what they are.
Yeah.
And so these people, I said, if you're having that person on again, can I be part of that debate? And when I've tried to do that several times, the person has, when they know it's me, I don't know why, whether they know me or not, but they've bottled out of it. It feels like that's what they've done. So I would love to be on a stage or in a podcast studio or on a radio program with somebody who is vehemently trans skeptic, because I don't have to defend anything. I don't opt in to who I am, but they opt in to deciding that I'm not legitimate. So if you want to have that debate, that's where it rests, because I have never known anything of my entire life. How I feel now as Freda, as trans, that's all I've ever known. It took me a while to work out how to express that, but so you could have all these philosophical discussions. You could be all, and get into the philosophy of what it means to be a person or a woman, what is a woman and all that. But at the end of the day, there's no absolute answers to that. So it's a political discussion that I want to have. And if trans people exist, then, and if you're going to make policy about us, it has to be humane. Mm-hmm. And that's it. That's the only thing I want.
Oh, okay. And I think that's all very reasonable, Freda. And, one of the things that I slightly suspect when you get such a strong reaction of people playing the man, not the ball, as we say, and,
or the tran, not the ball.
Also possible, is that you slightly suspect that maybe they're not entirely comfortable with the grounds that they're arguing on, and they're trying to divert from the from the subject, which I think they might be weaker on. And there are, in my view,
Can I just add something to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because what you're describing there is perfectly fine, but you've got to remember that trans people are not the authority on their own condition, on their own psychology. That's the preserve of psychologists and people that have studied the trans experience. As from a scientific point of view, trans people don't necessarily know what's going on with them. They're insecure. They're frightened. They may be depressed. Okay. They're not the best people to always ask, why are you trans?
Okay. Nevertheless, there is like an accepted orthodox trans view that might be promoted by Stonewall in the UK, by Tenny in Ireland. And it seems to me, and I'm going to ask you because you're the person I have here to ask. I'm not asking you in a tone that suggests that you are responsible for it, but I'll ask you since I can. There seems to be what seemed to me to be some errors, some inconsistencies, some logical fallacies in that whole position, and that one of the effects of that very poor quality of debate is that those errors, those inconsistencies never get ironed out. So, and I find that very frustrating, and that's one reason why I wanted to cover this on the podcast, to try and see what I perceive as an error or an inconsistency. Can somebody answer that, or can somebody accept that? And just in terms of basic factual error, if you Google the words completely reversible, just those two words, nothing else. If you Google those two words, you get a Google autofill of puberty blockers. And puberty blockers are drugs that were developed for other uses, but have been used in recent years, particularly in the past 5 or 6 years, for prepubescent children who have been identified as trans in order to prevent them from going through what is seen as the wrong puberty.
Yeah, I know that.
Yeah,
I know the
okay,
condition.
yeah, exactly. But not all the listeners may not be as fully up to speed on it, so I want to make sure I give that background. The problem is that these drugs are emphatically not, the use of them is emphatically not established to be completely reversible.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked previously on the podcast to Aoife Galler, who kind of spoke about the danger of taking a single source, which could be somebody on TikTok with 7 followers, or talking, a 15-year-old talking into their phone. And I think that's a very valid thing to say. So I'm trying to only look at sources that are very, very well established and all over the place, including in GCN, Gay Community News, which would be the primary LGBT publication in Ireland, stating as fact that puberty blockers given to children to prevent them going through puberty at the age it would normally be expected, stating as fact that they are completely reversible. That's over literally thousands of websites, so much so that Google has detected that there is a strong association between the phrase completely reversible and puberty blockers. GCN, as I say, have stated that as fact. And I note that actually 6 years ago at this stage, I spoke to then Senator Gillian Van Turnhout on this podcast. And I think perhaps we were both a bit confused, but I'm just going to play a clip of what we said then.
So you can get hormone treatment. Obviously, that would go to an endocrinologist, would have to, so you've quite a number of medical hoops to do to get the hormone treatment. If, let's say, the child then reaches 18 and actually says, you know what, I'm not so sure, and stopped taking that hormone treatment, it will have no long-term effect. It washes out of the system quite quickly. So, it's not something that has a lifetime effect.
Are you certain of that? As I understand it, and I'm not a medic, that, for example, hormones, male hormones taken by a female or vice versa, before or during puberty can have lifelong effects. You think that's not the case?
No, I have, because I checked this. That is not the case. That is absolutely not the case. It can take up to 2 years to wash out of the system as such, but it will not have a lifelong effect on it's delaying puberty rather than stopping puberty.
Now, I don't know where Gillian Van Turnhout got her information. I don't know where GCN got their information, but I've looked at this very, very carefully. And the logical steps that seem to be supporting this are that this particular drug, there is a condition known as precocious puberty, which is where a child, maybe 3-4 years of age, a girl might start having her periods, a boy might start developing in the way that you would normally expect in puberty. This is a very damaging condition for a whole bunch of reasons. This causes a lot of damage to a child, and these drugs are then given to the child who showed symptoms of precocious puberty until the age at when they would normally have puberty. Those drugs are then stopped, and then the child has their puberty at the normal age. And that's an accepted treatment. Those drugs are now vastly more than they have ever been used for anything else, are being given off label, that's to say without having gone through the normal testing, but just a doctor signing off that this should happen, to people to prevent them from having their puberty at the age 10, 11, 12, 13, that sort of age that you would normally expect. And it seems to me that this whole, and it is a mantra, this thing has been repeated so many times, that this is completely reversible, is just based on the fact that when children, toddlers who suffer from precocious puberty then have that treatment withdrawn, they go through normal puberty, and that is essentially normally a successful treatment. But puberty happens in parallel with a whole bunch of other things, including body development, skeletal development, brain development, and so forth. And I don't want to use language that talks about should happen, but in developmental terms, in biological terms, those skeletal developments, brain developments, and so forth should happen in parallel with puberty. That's one of the reasons why precocious puberty is quite a damaging condition. And there isn't a shred of evidence to say that it is safe for those non-puberty developments that happen during puberty, skeletal development, brain development, and so forth. There isn't a shred of evidence to say that that is safe to go ahead while the sexual element of puberty is being delayed artificially with drugs. there is evidence which doesn't rise to the level of scientific or medical proof, but it is indicative evidence that this can affect brain development, and there is very strong indicative evidence that this is causing loss of bone density, which would essentially mean somebody having osteoporosis, being at very high risk of breaking bones. Freda, the thing I'm worried about there is that people are being told in great numbers something that is just plain false. There's no debating that that's untrue. Isn't that the case?
Well, you just said a lot of things there, William.
Yeah.
A lot of things. You've covered a lot of things. Now,
to get it down, that the phrase saying puberty blockers, for trans is completely reversible.
Yeah.
In a word, that is untrue.
I was just saying that you said a lot.
Sure. Yeah. Yes.
Right. So if I can just breach you on those points.
Go right ahead.
So you started out by saying, when I Google this, the first thing that comes up is that, well, the thing is, when you Google puberty reversible, that's been searched for many, many times, and algorithmically, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get things that tell you about. If you do a quick Google search for me now with a simple word trans, you'll get a lot of Daily Mail articles. Yes. You'll get a lot of right-wing news. There's very, very few. You count the number of. You might get 2 positive trans stories in about 1,000 negative, and then one of the negative ones is always about trans children. Now, we should always be. We should always do the best thing for children. Obviously, that's without question. Now, when a child comes to their parents, possibly, or perhaps their guardian or teachers, and says, "I feel like I'm depressed and I'm questioning my gender," whatever. I don't know a child would express that at the moment. I don't think people see things online, or they might say, "I've seen this thing online. I think that relates to me." If that child, I mean, I don't know what age I'm imagining here, probably a child, maybe the youngest I would imagine that would be about 6 or 7. Now, if that 6 or 7-year-old child now went to a gender clinic, they'd have to wait 5 years, even before seen by a psychiatrist. That's where we're at. So when you're talking about children and puberty blockers in the UK, especially, it's not happening. You'd have to wait till you're 17 years old. Maybe if you went private, if you had enough money, you could pay a doctor a private psychiatrist, all that. You could always get that, but realistically, it's not happening. And also, if you want to talk about medical intervention with children, when you say puberty blockers are irreversible or reversible, a lot of medications have irreversible effects, including contraception. So when girls
that's absolutely true. But and I'm not, because neither you nor I, as far as I know, are medical doctors, and I don't think we should debate something outside our lane. But unarguably, the claim made by very prominent and very notable people on that, what we have agreed is a problematically referred to as the pro-trans side, is unarguably false. It's not debatable. It's unarguably false. I disagree. All things can have side effects, and all things can have. That's not a side effect. They are making a claim that it is completely reversible, and that claim is untrue. Right.
So you are of the opinion that no trans person under the age of what should get treatment?
No, I'm not under of any of those opinions, I'm not a medic and I'm not a psychiatrist, and I don't intrude into that.
What sort of age you think would be appropriate for puberty blockers?
I am not a psychiatrist and I'm not a doctor, and I'm not qualified to make a comment on that.
So,
but when other people who are not qualified to make a comment make very strident and very certain claims, I'm certainly qualified to say, hang on a second, the claim that you're making is untrue, and here is why it is untrue.
I can't see much evidence of that, because when I've Googled that, what you've just said, I've got lots of stories about the Tavistock. I've got people that have written there's been an orchestrated campaign against the Tavistock. I know there were so many problems with that place, and mainly because it was underfunded. They destroyed it by underfunding it, and people took their eyes off the ball. And then they claimed that people wanted to sue them. No, none of the service users sued the Tavistock. That was an apocryphal story by the Express.
Oh, okay, I understand, but I want to stay sharply focused, because I think it's better, Freda, that we kind of deal with one thing at a time. It is, as in my clip from the former senator, I have an article on GCN, Gay Community News, which is the leading LGBT publication in Ireland, stating as fact something which is emphatically not a fact.
Well, I would say in a medical situation, nothing is absolutely fact. Everything
which is
down
why
to
they should not say that.
Yeah, well, I agree with that, because if you're researching to find things out. And if you say this is a fact, well, it doesn't mean we don't help those children.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I agree with that. But that is a slightly separate issue, which I'm happy to come on to. But I want to try and keep our focus quite sharp. But go ahead in what you were saying.
I think it would be naive to suggest that within this debate that one of the main key points is about children. Now, we know that the people who are vehemently kind of trans skeptic don't want trans children, but it's like it's being, obviously it's a kind of shoe-in issue, because a lot of the public will say, oh my God, no, they're transing out, what they're doing to the children. And it's something that people politically has been used a lot. So we'd be naive to deny that.
Yeah, and to an extent, no, hold on for a second, Freda. To an extent, there is a Maud Flanders type reaction of, somebody think of the children going on here. And that's absolutely true. But I have, as you heard in my previous podcast and on other occasions, challenged people who disagree with you on the points that you focus on. But I don't have them here now, but I do have you here, which is why I'm asking you that. That's not to undermine the validity of what you're saying, but I want to focus. I do keep my focus very narrow. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I've been interrupting. The reason I want to interrupt you is because, like I said, this is a talking point that's used and weaponized by the tabloid media, and I'm not an expert in this. So now I can only talk about it like this. Now, I don't have children, but if I had a child and my child said to me, I think I might be questioning my gender, I say, that's fine, we all do. But we'll have that conversation. And as a parent, the first thing you should think really is, well, is this affecting their mental health? Is this, and then you have to go through all that. You have to see a psychiatrist. You have to go. It's not I'm just trying to convey to you how difficult the process is. That's if you have a parent that understands you. That's if you have a parent that loves you enough to say, okay, we'll see a psychiatrist. Because that happened to me when I was a child. I was 17 when I first started questioning my gender, and there was no real gender clinic there for me. I had to go to a child psychiatrist, and I was scared of this child psychiatrist because of the way he spoke to me. Now, that's my individual experience. That put me off seeking help for 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, that's clearly tragic. I don't want to personalize it to you
very much. I can only talk about this because I've got a dog in the fight. So I can only talk about this from a personal point of view. When you're talking to me about, shall we look at puberty blockers? I've not looked at those studies, but
I understand. Freda, but I just want to refine that slightly because I'm not. Because neither of us are qualified to talk about the pros and cons of puberty blockers. I'm talking about a comment that is made on people.
Of the child at heart.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is possible that there is an anxiety to be nice to trans people. That people want to wear on their sleeve how inclusive and progressive they are, and that can lead them not to question things which they would otherwise question, and that can lead to bad quality decisions. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned a child 6, 7, whatever years coming to a parent and expressing whatever they would have expressed, and that's entirely possible. Children of that age will also come to their parent and say that I'm a dinosaur, say I'm Superman, and so forth, and that will be pretty much get the reaction of, well, that's nice, darling, run along. There is a danger, at least theoretically, that if what they land on is not saying I'm a dinosaur, I'm saying I'm a girl if they're a boy, that can start a process that can potentially have consequences that lead to difficulties. But I want to park that for a little bit, because I just thought that was a good example of an error. But go ahead, yes, and then I'll go to the next question.
Can I ask you a question there?
I'm the interviewer, but I will indulge you. Go ahead.
So you were saying that people just kind of be polite or they want to be inclusive, but then you talked about the child again. So imagine most schools, I've not been at school for a long time, but they're quite brutal.
Yeah.
It's not easy to be different at school.
Yes.
And this idea that it's easy to come out as trans or approach anybody, and
I've never said that, although some people have said that. That's nonsense.
I agree. William, it doesn't happen. I would say to you,
I agree with you on that, Freda. I agree with you on that, which is why I'm not asking that question. There's probably a very long list of things that you and I both agree on, and we'd have a terribly boring podcast if I only asked those things, which is why I'm kind of focusing on the things that I suspect you might disagree on, or there's a bit of tension at least in it. Let me ask you then to move away from something that's like an absolute fact to something that seems to me to be a logical or a cognitive failure. And in this country, we have the IRFU, which is the governing body for rugby. And rugby occupies, I think, a fairly similar space in Ireland compared to in Britain, that it's kind of slightly posh sport, but also there's a fair amount of just, people playing a game or whatever. The IRFU, and for some years, quite some time, there's been also women's rugby. And the issue arose of trans women, which, for clarity, are people who are born men who then transition either socially or medically or surgically or some combination of the three to be women and present as women. The issue arose of trans women, not very many of them, playing rugby on women's teams. And the IRFU invested quite a lot of resources in studying this and taking expert advice. And they came up with a policy, and the policy essentially was to say that trans women were welcome to take part in women's rugby in coaching, in tag rugby, whereby touch rugby, whereby, you don't do these full body tackles, but in contact rugby, which is a very significantly physical sport. They said the evidence was that there was an unacceptable level of risk here, and they said that trans women could not take part in contact rugby, full contact rugby with women. There was an enormous hullabaloo over this in Ireland. Organisations which are significant taxpayer-funded organisations like TENI and Belong To really sent out an avalanche of criticism. There was a huge amount, not unlike my podcast, possibly even greater, of very hostile comment on Twitter along the lines, and in fact explicitly saying that the IRFU, which is like the rugby governing body, was a hate group, saying that they were, quote, motivated by nothing but bigotry. And I think that you can have a logical position whereby you could say that we shouldn't have any gender or sex discrimination or distinction or division that and happens in some countries on the continent. Gyms have unisex changing rooms and so forth. And that, you might like that or not like that, but that's, if you advocate for that, that's at least an intellectual, consistent point of view. But the point of view that was being promoted, which I can't quite square, and maybe you can help me, Freda, is that the rugby should be divided by gender, that's to say, gender expression, including trans women in women's teams, and not by sex, that is to say, what biological sex you are. And saying in really strident terms, and I don't want to repeat them, but this was not pleasant language, saying that the IRFU and anybody else who advocated for dividing rugby on sex lines were evil, bigoted people. And I can see how if you have a, public accommodation that is divided along gender lines, for example, a women's knitting circle or a men's card club, it seems fairly obvious that that division is rooted in gender. And if you want to divide that on a gender basis, that's fine. But where the rationale for the division is rooted in sex, I can't see why anybody has a problem with the division being by sex. And why is it that dividing by gender is okay and by sex is not? And I think it strikes me that nobody in that pro-trans movement has just sat down and thought that through. Do you have an answer for that?
Well, first of all, when it comes to sports, the sports most people play, the sports most people are involved in, and I would say most people listening to this, if they're involved in these sports, are not about biology, they're about community. And it's about mental health as well as physical health. And it's about, having a club and being a part of something lovely. Mm-hmm. Now you're talking about professional sports where
no, amateur rugby.
Well,
but still rugby.
In that case, you would have to ask the women. If there's a trans woman present, they must be friends. They must get on fine. So is it the biology of that person? If they were suddenly winning everything or be causing a problem because they were knocking women over, or if they were causing more injuries, because that's not a problem because they're trans. It's because they're just bigger. So if you want to look at it in that sense. Now, the reason I mentioned
but there is an association between sex and size. It's not perfect, and it's not not complete, but there is a strong association there, and that's why that division exists.
Right. So do you know how many trans, even amateur rugby players there are?
I mean, it's very small, but
there are about 5 that I can think of.
Okay, no, but deal with the core point that people are saying that it's okay, and actually lauding making a division per gender, and saying that a division per sex is downright evil, and I just don't see any rationale to that. Why is one superior to the other?
I don't want to use words like evil in a conversation where I know people say things like that, but
I'm quoting exactly what was said. But go ahead.
I don't think most people feel like that. I think what happens is they might see an instance with Leah Thomas, the swimmer, and that's a competition which swimming is there's so many variables in why people win things. It's not just about brute strength or being male or being female, but sports have always been divided up traditionally on sex, and this is why you get these kind of disparities. Now, it comes down to disparity and parity. So if you were to look at sport overall, and if you were to look at female football, and then I don't know if you saw the 2019 Women's World Cup.
I'm missing the sport, Gene, but go on anyway.
But I love women's football. I love the Lionesses, because I think what they do is uplift.
This is the English women's football team. Yeah.
Yeah,
I know that much. I have just exhausted my entire sports knowledge. By the way, go on. I'll
come back to that point in a minute. But within the women's FIFA World Cup, you had players 17 years old playing against ladies that were 43 years old, and that's an actual fact. So if you want to talk about parity, the point is, the reason people are focusing on the trans issue here is to find the delineation, to find examples of where sex can matter in those situations, but they transpose that onto amateur sports and then further into society. So we're finding instances where trans women are defined more by sex than gender, which can happen in elite sport. It can happen, but it's not exclusive to that, because we know there are powerful women who are up against weaker women. So if your argument is about strength, and another point I would say, going back to the Lionesses.
No, but I'm not, and I perhaps the issue that I want to focus on is a secondary one to that, which is what I view as, and going back to my point that when you have this very, very vitriolic argument, you get a lot of heat, you don't tend to get much light, and this is a question that I have tried to ask a number of times, and I haven't got a sensible answer on. Why is dividing, be it sport or be it knitting or be it playing cards or be it anything else, why is making a division by gender morally superior to making a division by sex? Why would one of those be morally better than the other?
I don't think it's a moral question. I think the science needs to be done.
No, but there are a great number of commentators who are stating that with great vehemence, including TENI and Belong To, both of which are taxpayer-funded organisations for representing trans and LGBT people. And it is, I think, reasonable to ask them, if they are making this statement, to say that, and using words like evil and bigot, and saying that dividing any activity by sex is evil and springs from bigotry, let's divide it by gender instead. I think it's reasonable to ask, why is dividing it by gender morally superior? And, Freda, you're more than free to say you don't know or you don't agree. But I think it's reasonable to ask that question. I think it's remarkable that it has not been thought through.
Well, to me, it comes down to why. Like, if you talk, I don't know how many if you could find out how many trans women are involved in sports, professional sports, whatever. If you took those trans women out, sport isn't going to get any fairer. I'm skirting around
an issue that I think I'll probably agree with you on 100%. Sport just isn't fair, full
stop. There would be no point in a trans woman being in a sport if she was winning everything. If she was some kind of superwoman and she just won everything outright, what's the point? What would be the point in her even competing for herself? See, this is the point I want to come back to, William,
Yeah.
is like when I spoke about women's football, the reason I like women's football is because it's uplifting. People don't necessarily watch sport to see who's the strongest. It's about the stories of the people. It's about striving. It's about that humanity of doing something that's bigger than than the base of yourself. And that is what it's about. That's why people feel strongly about sport. When people cheer for their team, that's a community thing. So when you take that away from trans people, you're denying them that kind of humanity.
To be clear, that wasn't taken away, and the IRFU said that trans women could play on the men's team. You are correct. Yes, there are.
But there are people about people use the word evil, but there are people in this debate that don't want trans women to play sport.
Yeah, I agree. And there are people who use that and have said explicitly that they're using that issue as a wedge issue to try to divide their enemies.
Everything you've mentioned so far is to do with making trans women seem like a problem to society. There might be
Freda, there is a refinement to that I think that what I think we both agree is an often very poor level of engagement with the actual issues on the part of what is being called the pro-trans side means that genuine issues don't get thrashed out and don't get resolved, and people who have ill intent can point at that and say, see, those people, those pro-trans people are all hypocrites, and they can point to genuinely incorrect things being said and genuinely irrational arguments being made and say, see, by contrast, that proves how rational and correct we are. And I think it ill serves.
I don't think any of this is rational. I don't think many people are either. When you think about it as sides, that isn't rational anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. But that is the paradigm we're in, and we can't necessarily escape that.
So if I could just say again, like when you talk about these issues, sports, you talked about prisons. You can talk about single-sex spaces. These arguments have become sort of popularized, I would say, by people that really hate trans people. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have those discussions. It means they can't come from them. They must come from policymakers.
Yes, but when you get people who set themselves up as trans rights advocates, not necessarily, not including you on that, who say that anyone who says anything about trans women in women's prisons is necessarily an evil bigot, and by necessity, because they are an evil person, and we know they're an evil person because they're talking about this, and they are therefore necessarily wrong, and therefore I won't answer their arguments. That's the difficulty that I think we run into there. It is.
But if I could just add something to that.
Yeah.
So when we have these arguments, it takes away the humanity of things.
I agree.
Do you believe these arguments help women?
I have no idea. I think these arguments. I think the argument doesn't help anybody.
Do you think women in prison are helped by having this debate?
They want to have. You know what, Freda? I think that probably Tucker Carlson didn't have very high on his radar the welfare of women in prisons in the United States, or the welfare of girls playing sports in American high schools, or the rights of elite sportswomen. I'm pretty sure that those issues never crossed his mind, and certainly never were highlighted by him before the fact, before the time that they came convenient for that. But that doesn't. Yeah, but Freda, that doesn't necessarily. Just because there are people on Fox News or whatever operating in bad faith, that doesn't mean that anybody who addresses that, I understand, that doesn't mean that anybody who addresses that argument. And the real argument here, and you mentioned the Tavistock, and I said I would come back to that.
I've not answered that question yet.
Go ahead. Yes, so moral difference, moral superiority of dividing by gender, not sex. Tell me.
When you're talking about sports, when you're talking about prisons especially, what you need to do is a risk assessment, and that's what government should be doing. They shouldn't be having these emotional arguments about what the public feel. The public can be swayed very easily with emotional arguments. You need to do the risk assessment. It's as simple as that.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter @Here'sHowPodcasts, and Freda's Twitter is offline at the moment, but you can catch the Gender Nebulous podcast at gendernebulous.co.uk. And get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or topic for a future show. And thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon, It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going. And if you'd like to throw in the price of a bar of chocolate once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Fulf. Thank you for listening.